Today's talk is about the uh, Labour governments of 1924 and 1929 and 31, and it's really the first experiment, as it were, a safe experiment of a Labour government. And the reason why I thought that we ought to talk about this is because I think it raises some basic issues about how a Labour government has behaved, but maybe the attitude of socialists towards the ideas of going into government, and in particular the idea of what sort of program socialists should be campaigning for, particularly as this is a period which has gone down in Labour history, particularly the 29 to 31 government, as being, you know, the great betrayal. For those of us of an older generation, and I'm really talking now about people who might be, you know, 70 plus, MacDonald, the betrayal of MacDonald, was still a theme that came up in the Labour movement in the 1970s and the 1980s. The SDP's formation, and of course the Callaghan government of the late 70s all seem to throw these questions up. So in many ways, this is part of the sort of folklore of the Labour Party and the Labour movement. One of the folkloric elements is, of course, is that there are goodies and baddies. And Ramsay MacDonald is the traitor. He's somebody who's, you know, sold out the movement, and he embraced the aristocracy and the establishment, and he stabbed the Labour movement in the back. He ushered the way into a reactionary government in the 1930s, and his betrayal is then counterposed to the loyalty of other members of the party who stayed on and continued the struggle for socialism. So I think that the sort of potency of this mythology, and by that I don't mean a lie, I mean a story that conveys certain meanings about aspects of the Labour left, has been very powerful, and I want to investigate it this evening. When I was reviewing this early today, I realized that there was quite a lot of detail, and in fact the detailed events, particularly of August 1931, are covered in quite a number of texts. Miliband looks at it in great detail, but there are also a number of specialist accounts. I think Robert Skidelsky's Politicians and the Slump is also worth looking at. You might look at some sort of standard historical accounts as well as those on the left. First of all, then, let's look at the first Labour government in 1924. The first Labour government was unexpected. Labour had done quite well in the elections, but the major pattern was in fact the collapse of the Liberal vote, the divisions in the Liberal vote, and in particular, the way that increasingly many middle-class voters and indeed many professional politicians could now gravitate towards the Labour Party. It also, I think, tells us something about the nature of MacDonald's socialism, or how he defined socialism, which of course is often counterposed very clearly to that of the left, and particularly the ILP, who are a very important element in the Labour Party. And I want to perhaps address that question, because when we come to periods of crisis, we often find that many people on the left are not able to counterpose a very clear alternative to what the MacDonald leadership is doing. On the documents that I've put up already, the manifesto is document number 2, and you can see the nature of that manifesto. It's couched in quite left-wing terms. I mean, it's certainly very well to the left of anything in the post-war period, and it certainly talks about transforming society and about change. But it does it in I think, a fairly piecemeal way. It talks, for example, about a more equitable distribution of the nation's wealth by constitutional means. So this idea that Labour would be a very constitutional party, indeed a very conventional party, was pretty well established. the idea of going into government wasn't inevitable in 1923-24. I won't look at the detailed parliamentary arithmetic, but essentially it meant that there could have been a coalition government between the Liberals and the Conservatives, but it was decided quite openly that this would be quite a good time for an experiment. And in the words of one Conservative leader, that it was too weak to do much harm, but not too weak to get discredited. And so any really radical measures that it might have attempted could easily have been outvoted, by the Liberal and the Conservative parties. Now, it's often suggested, or it was suggested at the time, I should say, that this minority position constrained the Labour leadership, and that having gone into government, they were in government, but they were not in power, that any measure could be vetoed. And indeed, the way that the government collapsed, this seems to sort of suggest that that was the reason. The left argued that that what MacDonald should do would be to become Prime Minister, lay forth a very radical programme, challenge the Conservatives and the Liberals to vote against it, and expose them then for the capitalist parties that they were. Now, this was never MacDonald's intention, and indeed whether this is a particular strategy that should be followed, whether it's a sufficiently educative strategy, whether it really does advance the cause of socialism, I think we should discuss. It's, for example, an issue that arose recently to a certain extent in Ireland about the formation of a left government following the elections there. The other element, of course, is that the Labour MPs newly elected in 1922 and 1923, they come into Parliament, and then they suddenly face this aristocratic and constitutional parliamentary embrace. In their memoirs, and their diaries are often very useful in this way, they're feted by the Conservatives. They get to meet all sorts of public figures. And indeed, there's a great deal of amusement, both amongst Conservatives and Liberals, at the way that these hotheads, these radicals, are somewhat tamed by going into Parliament in that way. Even, for example, whether they will put on court dress, whether they will kiss the hands of the king, all the sort of constitutional fol-de-lol. Again, that has echoes of what Jeremy Corbyn was asked to do when he became a member of the Privy Council. So again, we build up this image of sort of confused, maybe overawed left-wingers coming into Parliament, and therefore they're sort of fatally embraced by the state. The state has its way of winning them over. Now, I think there's an element of truth in that to a certain extent. I think that obviously entering the house of the enemy, as it were, and then finding yourself at the head of this government machine, you inevitably become a prisoner. The other evening, Ben Lewis referred to the way that Kautsky was given a fairly innocuous job of sorting through the Grosse Cabinet materials on German foreign policy. And you might argue that Labour politicians faced with running the great departments of state suddenly found themselves almost like a learned driver at the seat of a Rolls Royce and not quite knowing what to do. But I think there's also something else, and this is that the strategy of the Labour leaders was really to prove, and they said this quite openly, was to prove their statesmanship and their respectability. That there was never there was never a strategy of, for example, confronting that state, of exposing that state. Indeed, it was almost like a job interview to prove that Labour could be a reliable and statesmanlike party. As if to help that on its way, many of the members of that cabinet particularly in offices related to the law or to the military, were in fact conservatives or liberals or very recent converts to Labour. So Labour would almost by definition have been, a reliable party. But I think it's the left that are more interesting in this regard, in that the left in the parliamentary Labour Party has grown. It's centred around the Independent Labour Party. The Independent Labour Party has its own sort of organisation. It still retains its own structures, and indeed increasingly functions in that phrase as a party within a party. But the ILP supported MacDonald, partly because of his opposition to the war, but also because one of the things that I think it's very important to remember, and certainly if you look at the Labour Party conference materials, was that MacDonald did play as a man of the left. And even into, I think, the early 1930s, 1930 itself, although he was clearly, moving to the right, he was still able, in great flights of rhetoric, to persuade the party conference that his sincerity was, his heart was in the right place. And I think this relationship between leaders and followers, and in particular, the ability of leaders to tack to the left, is a very important theme. I think it's also important when we consider this idea of betrayal to sort of move away from something of the sort of great man of history or the sort of Richard III syndrome, where the villain is determined to pull the wool over people's eyes. Because one of the problems, I think, one of the problems with the left of the Labour Party was that they were in many ways rebels without a programme or a strategy. Many of them were individual rebels. Many of them, for example, on the Clive side, had been involved in the militant movement there. But their idea of a clear programme or a clear strategy of what they were going to do when they became MPs, I think, was very weak. In particular, their strategy seemed to be to try and hold the Labour leaders to account, to try and control what was going on, but the mechanisms to do that, and above all, building up any sort of current or tendency that would put pressure on the structures of the party to do that, was also quite sadly lacking as well. So what we have then is quite a strong verbal left, one that, for example, is able to make militant speeches in Parliament on occasion, but doesn't, I think, have an idea of any real long-term strategy, certainly in relation to the Labour right, and I think more importantly, in relation to the state and to the wider issue of building socialism. In fact, one of the points, and it's a criticism from me, in a sense, on the left, is that both left and the right of the parliamentary Labour Party and large sections of the Labour Party shared, I suppose, a common set of assumptions, both about the constitutional machinery, but also about how socialism would simply evolve out of a series of legislative practices, that it would, in a sense, be a process that would emerge in a way almost naturally from within the Labour Party, or through the election of more and more left-wing Labour MPs. And the actual mechanisms and the actual strategy to achieve that, I think, was sadly, not only sadly lacking, but it was something that was shared in common by both the right and the left. Labour's record in government was modest. Again, you can read the accounts about housing reform, educational reform, but probably it's what they didn't do that leads to the most attention. And again, I've indicated some of the criticisms or the implied criticisms in the documents there. The government ended, or MacDonald deliberately put forward a vote of made an issue of confidence around his handling of the Campbell case. Again, a notorious case which you can read up on a little more. But it would seem to suggest that in many ways, MacDonald almost wanted to be defeated. He'd sort of come to the end of his period, and his function of trying to establish the bona fides of the government was done. He would then move on. The election itself is again a fairly notorious one because of the Zinoviev letter, a text of which is included in documents 6 to 10. Again, I won't look at that here. It's notorious. It was, I think, a clear forgery and also a clear attempt by the Conservatives to try and tar Labour with a communist brush, as if there were any real connections between Ramsay MacDonald and any form of leftism, much let alone Bolshevism in that way. What's interesting in the 24 election, though, is that Labour's vote held quite well. What the Conservatives did win and did come back into government, they did win, but their vote was largely made up of Liberals defecting from the Liberal Party to the Conservatives. So that by the 24 election, essentially Labour had established itself as the main anti-conservative party. And I use that phrase anti-conservative quite deliberately because it was a home to the more left Liberals who were clearly anti-conservative, but it was not explicitly or clearly a socialist class party. It was a labourist party, and although it talked about socialism, that remained a fairly poorly defined term. So what we have then is polarized politics between a party representing property and bourgeois society and a party representing the labour interest. And this, in a sense, is going to be the pattern of politics for the rest of the 20th and indeed the 21st century. Now, what I would like to look at now is really that period leading up to the Labour government of 1929 to 31, and in particular, the growth of the Labour left. The general strike, which occurs bang in the middle of this period, is obviously very significant, and I think deserves a separate session. There are many gaps in this course, and that's just one of them. But I think it's important to note that the left did grow. And that left grew at various levels. It grew at the constituency level. And it also grew in an organised form in the Independent Labour Party. There were two organisational forms for the growth of this left. One was the Independent Labour Party itself, which started to produce explicitly distinct programmes, one called Socialism in Our Time. In many ways, a sort of proto-Keynesian programme, very clearly left reformist, but a much more sort of detailed, worked out programme in comparison with aspects of the Labour programme. The other current was the national left-wing movement, which did include both left reformists and also some people who were close to the Communist Party of Great Britain and indeed were Communist Party members. This was quite a large current, both as an impact of the general strike and the disappointments of the last Labour government in 1924. Both the industrial and the political left in the movement, the left as represented by A.J. Cook, a leading miners leader, and Jimmy Maxton from the two wings of the movement came together again from a left position, but the nature of both their definitions of socialism and more importantly how that socialism would be achieved. For example, would it be largely through legislative change? Would it be through industrial action? Meant that in many ways, although the rhetoric was more to the left than, say, in the Labour Party documentation, it did share a sort of common set of rhetorics, and indeed, I'd say, perspectives with MacDonald. So when we wonder why MacDonald was able, for example, to appeal so successfully to Labour Party conferences, and he did this, it was because what many people called his woolly rhetoric and his rather sort of vague aspirations were in a sense connected in quite a linear way. There wasn't a very sharp break between his position and that of many of the people on the left. So this idea of a clear distinction between a right-wing leadership and the left, which is often talked about, and indeed the formation of the government seems to suggest it, I think isn't there. And it means that clarity, particularly about our definitions and our understandings of socialism, I think is absolutely crucial in this way. Now, this issue, this difficulty, I think, emerges most plainly with the re-election of a Labour government in 1929. Again, Labour has done quite well in the election. The electorate has expanded. Remember that all adults over 21 now have the right to vote. So the electorate is expanded from 22 to 29 million people. And Labour's vote, it does increase. But even so, there's still quite a strong Conservative vote. And that pattern of polarization that I talked about before continues. The Liberals are now down to 59 and very clearly don't really figure, I think politically. Now, MacDonald's cabinet, when it emerges, is representative of the Labour leadership. It's representative of the right of the Labour leadership. So with people like Clines as Home Secretary, Snowden as Chancellor, J.H. Thomas at Lord Privy Seal, and so forth, it's a fairly cautious and a fairly safe right-wing candidate. Also, despite the arguments from the left that the cabinet should represent the party, and also those people who argued that there should be very tight controls over policy, for example, making the government accountable to the Labour Party NEC, making the government accountable to the Parliamentary Labour Party, and above all, making what the government's doing accountable to the conference. This was not achieved in any shape or form, and indeed, I think that does pose some of the problems that if we consider that simply putting in place left leaders or supporting leaders who may be considered a step on the way, how do we direct and how do we control them? In some of our discussions last week about the SPD and about the German situation, that also was a problem, and indeed that did arise out of the specific role of the anti-socialist law in a sense separating the parliamentarians from German socialism. But it was even more of a question in Britain, where parliamentary traditions and the idea that MPs were, in a sense, representatives of their constituents, not delegates of a party, was even more strongly imbued. The other interesting thing as well, and this I think is often picked up on in even many of the sort of standard historical accounts, is that in confronting the main problems that the Labour government faces between 1929 and 1931, that MacDonald often uses not just left-wing rhetoric, but left-wing explanations to justify quite right-wing positions. And I think this is again often overlooked. When, for example, the left say to him, do something about unemployment, implement a Keynesian-style program, MacDonald replies to them that he replies in two ways. First of all, he says that it's a crisis of capitalism, it's international, and that we all know that unemployment is endemic in capitalism, and until we achieve socialism, there's not much that we can do. But of course, in the meantime, what I'm going to do is essentially implement traditional orthodox capitalist policies. So he uses that sort of language, that sort of rather realistic language, but drawn from aspects of the left's own arguments. And again, something which later on many people on the left, or even on the centre of the Labour Party, will tend to play down. What they will tend to argue is that MacDonald, for example, has always been a traitor, that he's always been an agent of the ruling class in the Labour Party, whereas they've always been consistent left-wingers. But what they also overlook is his ability to persuade, because I think most of the left does not have a clear understanding either of the state and of the role of government, but above all, a clear conception about what they mean by socialism, about how that's going to be achieved, and about the nature of the type of transformation of society it entails. So MacDonald's able to sort of work on that same ground. I was suggesting that that MacDonald's arguments were often taken from the left themselves, and that the weaknesses of the left meant that they, in a sense, were working in a similar sort of framework to him. The other element was, of course, that many of the right wing of the Labour Party, Philip Snowden's a good example of this, were in many ways quite orthodox financiers, budget opposition to budget deficits, and in many ways were almost Gladstonian liberals. So when in the summer of 1931 they were confronted with a financial crisis, particularly one that seemed to argue that Britain would face financial bankruptcy, that there would be massive deficits, and indeed what became known in the parlance as a banker's ramp, a financial crisis. Again, we would have probably seen all of this with the Corbyn government. Then the options appeared to be quite narrow. Now, what occurs in August 1931 is really quite a complex set of events. And again, I don't intend, because of the time available, to really go into them in any great detail. But I think there are three themes that I want to try and get across. The first one is that the government had been considering what would be fairly orthodox balanced budgets and cuts to unemployment benefit, cuts to public expenditure, really from 1930 onwards. So these were being discussed in the cabinet. And indeed, many members of the cabinet who later claimed to be opponents of MacDonald had agreed to them in principle. So in a sense, the debate was more about the structure and the nature, not the particular, not the principle. They'd agreed. Henderson, for example, who emerges as Labour Party leader after the collapse of the government in 1931, claims to have been opposed to them, but the minutes show that he was willing to accept them. So there is indeed a fair degree of consensus, and indeed in the parliamentary Labour Party as well, several of the votes support the principle of cuts and of fairly orthodox financial policies. The other key element is the reaction of the left, which is obviously to try and defend the levels of public spending, to oppose cuts to unemployment benefit. But again, in terms of a specific program and in terms of how that might be actually achieved, no really clear organizational form had been built up. And indeed, in the period leading up to the crisis, the ILP, which was not, although it's often synonymous with the left had in fact split in various ways, it too was taking very different positions in which loyalty to MacDonald and loyalty to the government seemed to be a paramount theme. But I suppose the key question in terms of the split of the government is why it actually occurred at all. Because the cabinet, there was a majority in the cabinet for the type of public expenditure cuts that the May Committee and indeed bankers and the opposition were calling for. So why did MacDonald take the line that he did? Why was the national government, why was splitting the government so important? Well, I think that this again points to the depth of the crisis. It points to the idea that Labour would be susceptible to pressures, and that a national government, particularly using the crisis to break up the Labour Party to install a national coalition government would be in the best way to get a mandate for fairly strong action. And that even if a majority of the cabinet backed the cuts, groups like the TUC didn't, and because the TUC represented the organised working class, that would mean that Labour could prove to be unreliable. But the significant thing for me is that MacDonald, when confronted with that crisis, decided, I think, that essentially his policies, his strategy would be best pursued outside of the Labour Party. And his policy and his strategy, when called into question, amounted to no more really than continuing the status quo. So although the left could be accused of confusing his woolly rhetoric with reality, could be accused of being too loyal to him, he, I think, had really demonstrated his loyalty to both conventional financial politics and towards capitalism. And what emerges from the diaries and from the various first-hand accounts, from the negotiations that MacDonald has with the King, with the other opposition parties, is his absolute desire to be loyal, his absolute desire to uphold the constitutional system. Also his absolute desire to wreck the Labour Party. I think what again is quite important here is that although up to 8 members of his cabinet are willing to serve in either a Labour government or I would suggest a coalition government, he rejects that idea out of hand and says that they wouldn't be reliable and says that we need a new form of national consensus. And this idea of consensus, I think, had been one that had been long coming in MacDonald. And I think the question that it raises for us is that one that came up with in the first talks on the formation of the Labour Party about the nature of this party. And that is that it often has leaders and it has elements which are clearly pro-capitalist. But it also has a rank and file which is rooted in the working class, particularly in the organised working class, and as such is then susceptible not only to pressures, but is also a constant battleground between different ideas and different tendencies. Now, the argument I put here is that the distinction between the left, even the best of the left, and Ramsay MacDonald, is not as great as later legend and indeed later differentiation would have. My argument is that their conceptions of socialism are equally nebulous. And indeed, the fact that MacDonald was the darling of the conference often, I think would illustrate, that. But I think it's also clear that many of those people on the left did represent wider aspirations towards socialist change. And that makes the Labour Party often distinctly unreliable as the second 11 of capitalism. So although the team captain and the leading players would be equally at home in the other side, many of their followers are a little unruly and therefore not always entirely reliable. But of course, what comes after MacDonald, particularly after the defeat of the Labour Party and the crushing victory that the national government has in 1931, is, I think, an interesting period. Ralph Miliband describes it as MacDonaldism without MacDonald. And a leader like Arthur Henderson, who takes over the leadership and proclaims his loyalty to the Labour Party, is, I think, the perfect sort of transitional figure. And again, illustrates some of the weaknesses in the history of the Labour Party, illustrates some of the weaknesses in not having clear differentiations between left and right in the party, and in particular between those who really want to confront and change and overthrow capitalism and those who just want modifications. Henderson denies his role in the public expenditure cuts, denies that he was willing to be loyal to MacDonald. He insists that he was always an opponent when the records show, that that's plainly not true. But what MacDonald does is he acts as a sort of safe pair of hands who manages to steer Labour through the 1930s, and in that way, in a way, sort of be a continuity candidate, so that when the left emerges again, as it will do, and we will look at that next week in terms of 1945, it doesn't do so as, I think, a complete break with the type of socialism and parliamentary socialism that MacDonald upholds. So although we might counterpose 1945 to 1931, I think there are these patterns of continuity. And it's in that Labourism, as Miliband describes it, that I think we will see some of these tensions, but above all, we will see some of these ideas of betrayal because of our, I think, misunderstanding of the nature of the left and the right in the Labour Party. But I'll leave it there. I think I probably have stuck to my 30 minutes, but with interruptions.
Hi. Yeah, you said something which about just finding it now. Hold on. Yeah, the party not having a very good, no real understanding of the state and how the state works, and maybe how the state is a constant drag, and the institutions and how they're all there to prevent any real change. And I listened to the Burner from Novara Media last night, and there was a slot by Aaron Bastani who posed the question, does the left need to be a bit more Leninist in the same way as the right, not the right of the party, but the right of the spectrum has been Leninist, in so much as, during the 60s, the 50s onwards, they really took a very strategic long-term game to bombard people with ideological ideas and to soften up the ground, so that when it came to Thatcher and Reagan, neoliberalism could come into place, because they basically they did entryism or whatever takeover of the whole consensus, through public think tanks and so on, and all of that. I don't know if I've made that clear, but they had an idea of what they needed to do to get power and to hold power and achieve power. And maybe on the left, we're always a bit woolly about it. And, maybe it's partly to do with the tradition of parliamentarianism and gradualism and stuff like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, somebody just pointed out quite rightly, Ken, thanks, Ken, that could you please introduce yourselves a little bit when you're speaking from the floor? Sorry, Richard, I should have said it before. And also Ian Drummond, Kevin, doesn't want to speak, but he's asking, where do you think the general strike fits in between these two Labour governments? In 2 minutes or less, please. No, I'm only joking. Okay, and now I'm taking Jonathan Cooper next.
Thank you, Tina. Comrades, I'm wondering,
Introduce yourself a bit.
I'm Jonathan from Greenwich Momentum and Greenwich and Woolwich CLP, also a member of Unite and Equity. I'd like to ask Kevin if the gap between the leadership of the party and the grassroots left had a lot to do with Ramsay MacDonald essentially becoming part of the very thing the Labour Party was set up to destroy.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, Ken quite rightly pointed out that we are looking at perhaps doing another session on the general strike. Ian just mentioned that as well. But maybe Kevin's got something quick to say anyway. I'm bringing in Peter Kennedy next. I'm unmuting you now.
All right,
Hello.
okay. Hi there, Pete Kennedy. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for the talk, mate. Very interesting. I was just wondering on there's two questions. One, a very brief one from me, but maybe longer answer from you. What did you mean by a misunderstanding of the left and right in the Labour Party at that particular time we're talking about in the 20s? Do you mean, for example, that there's a misunderstanding by members or people who are looking to the Labour Party to change, that there was a left and right, when in fact they were both variants of dealing with capitalism and managing capitalism? Is that what you meant, or something else? And so we sow illusions in the Labour Party in that way. And the second one, just curiosity really. Given the, what looked like to be, political chaos within the Labour Party in terms of a coherent response to the situations presented in Britain during the time of the 20s, then, and obviously being the first in power as well, the first Labour government in power, then I'm just curious as your view on the the Liberal Party at the time, especially late in the 20s. And they were organised themselves around these yellow books, which are about industrial partnerships between owners and workers on corporate boards, tripartite system developing, controls over capital flows, international as well, capital flows abroad, full employment, and in total you could say a managed capitalism, a kind of corporatism. And that seemed to be, I don't agree with it, because it kind of ties labour and labour power and its exploitation into capitalism, which for me was in decline at the time. But nevertheless, it seems to be more coherent than the Labour Party at the time, even though the Labour Party were beginning to challenge the Liberals and outpace them in terms of attracting support from the working class. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. I'm bringing in Pauline Fraser next. Hello, I'm unmuting you now. There you go.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Yes, yes, Kevin, I wanted to ask you, I don't think you mentioned the leadership of George Lansbury. I'd like to hear a bit about that. And also the relationship of the Labour Party to the Communist Party, which was formed in 1920, because there was an awful lot of period of toing and froing, and people would be in both, and at one time and another. I know my grandparents were, but particularly my grandfather, so I'm quite interested in that. Thank you.
I definitely think we need another session on that as well, actually,
okay.
Labour Party and Communists. Kevin, do you want to reply to some things already, or shall I collect some more?
Yeah, I'll come in largely because I might go dead altogether. First of all, on the general strike, yeah, you're right, it is another topic. What I would say is that it I think does focus a degree of attention on ideas of workers' power, on the role of the industrial movement, and indeed whether Parliament itself is a means of achieving socialism. So I think that you might well see the growth of a left in the unions as a result of what might be considered the disappointments of the first Labour government. So I think that there is often in Labour history a tendency for the industrial and the political movements to influence each other. But it is a much bigger question, and I think it does deserve a separate topic in that way. I think that Pauline's point about the relationship between the Communist Party of Great Britain and the Labour left is an interesting one, and I think just seeing a few messages going up saying that would be a good additional session. Yes, up until 25, 26, and probably later, even I think as late as 28, there would be individual members of the Communist Party who were in the Labour Party, and indeed there were a number of MPs who were candidates, and indeed there were 2 Labour MPs who were members of the Communist Party. So the links between the two are important. The national left-wing movement that I talked about is well worthy of study. One, because it's quite highly organised and it's quite large, and I think is also quite a coherent formation. And that's clearly, I think, has a nucleus of Communist Party members in it. But it does deserve, I think, a much further study. I referred to some articles by Lawrence Parker on that, and they really are well worth looking at, particularly the Sunday Worker newspaper. Richard, you ask there about I suppose, entrism or Leninism and so on. I think that the state is a capitalist institution. So when you talk about neoliberalism trying to seize the state, I'm not sure that I would quite phrase it like that. I think the way that you might want to think about it is that factions and tendencies in the ruling class might want to gain, more predominance, and might want to gain more influence over particular parts of the state, forward their policies and so on. And as I think I've said before, that we often, the old cliche is that, the left talks about the class war, but the Tories, practice it, and their hardness and their desire to use the state and its instruments, as was, for example, demonstrated in the general strike with the OMS strike breaking, and indeed the way that they played a fairly hard hand in relation to the relatively to the capitulatory tactics of the TUC leadership, I think is a good example of that. What I would suggest, though, and I think this to me is a central question, both I think in the 20s, but perhaps given the reversal of things that have occurred in the last 30 or 40 years, is the development of, I suppose, not just of socialist policies, socialist groupings, but a wider conception of a socialist movement. Interestingly, George Lansbury, who Pauline refers to, and who does become Labour leader in the 30s for a short period, one of the arguments he puts forward is that Labour can't really take power because there isn't a sufficient socialist culture. And I think he's accurate in that, but it isn't just, I think, an understanding of socialism as a culture. It's also an understanding of socialism being the self-activity of the working class. And it's our relationship then to Parliament and to parliamentary institutions that socialism won't be achieved, for example, through a series of legislative stages, that it will require, transformatory politics. It will require workers running society. In other words, it's revolutionary in a way that legislative change isn't. Now, the form that might take in a developed capitalist economy, in particular, how that develops internationally, I think is one that was discussed both at the time and since. But I think that if we look at socialism as in a sense coming from socialism from below and not the product of parliamentary change, although we might use Parliament as a platform, as a way of building support for socialist politics, then I think we can see that the differences between the left and the right, between some elements in the Labour, the right of the Labour leadership and the ILP, who talked about socialism in our time, but when it came down to what that meant, it meant really just more legislative programs. And indeed, if the state does behave in the way that Richard suggests, then they would have been fairly ruthlessly challenged. So my argument about the similarities between them is that MacDonald, quite openly uses this rhetoric, but it's quite clear that he's going to essentially accept the status quo. The left don't want to accept the status quo, but there doesn't seem from both their program and their strategy that there's any way in which they can overcome that. Because without posing it in revolutionary terms, they're in a sense going to work within the system, that they will find themselves managing that system, whatever their subjective wishes. Lenin in left-wing communism refers to a sensorimeter, a meter that tests your sincerity. And no one will deny people's sincerity, but you can see that a left leader placed in the same position as MacDonald may well have had to have implemented certain of the same policies that if he didn't, he would either have been forced to, or he would have been forced out of office. Then Jonathan, you talk about the sort of break between the leadership and the grassroots. Well, I think MacDonald's popularity shows that many people in the grassroots, although quite sincere in wanting socialist change and quite sincere in desiring some sort of socialism, were very unclear on what that meant, and they might frame it in terms of quite nebulous ideas. Again, I use the phrase woolly rhetoric, which was used by supporters of MacDonald, and I think that in a way MacDonald was played upon the lack of clarity. And again, this reflects some of the weaknesses of the British Labour Party in comparison with other movements which grew out of forms of Marxism. And although often when faced with crises, their leaders, behaved in particular ways, it was always quite possible to crystallize tendencies and arguments and currents because you could work within a common framework. Again, referring back to the discussion about the German SPD, people like Liebknecht and Luxemburg were able to use the common sort of sense and culture of the party that had been developed previously by Kautsky and Bebel to hold Kautsky and those other people to account. In Britain, as I hope I've demonstrated, is that socialism still remains, an aspiration and a set of woolly rhetorics rather than very clearly thought out theoretical programs.
Thanks, Kevin. The next two speakers are Alan Donovan. I'm taking you first, and I'm unmuting you now. Hi.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks, Kevin. It's very interesting talk again this week. I think what I'd like to do is to see what, as left and socialists, we would be learning from the past. I think firstly, in relation to the left independent party side of things that you talked about, and whether it's important that we have a strong, separate left section that is united rather than fragmented as it possibly has been in recent years. The second thing is, I think it's been quite clear that can socialism and the left work in a minority government? And was the main problem that Ramsay MacDonald had wasn't so much Ramsay MacDonald, but the position that he was put in. The main reason for this question is that I think we all accepted that if Corbyn had got the extra votes in the 2017 election, we would have been in a situation where he would have more than likely been in a minority government rather than a majority government. And how would that have worked? The other thing is that we have a lot of talk over the recent years that as far as proportional representation, and should the Labour Party be supporting or not supporting proportional representation, as would it have more chance of getting into government under proportional representation? But my question is there any point in getting into government under proportional representation? As I think your first point of this evening's lecture is there any point in being in government if you are not in power? Thank you.
Okay, we only have one more speaker from the floor, that's David. If you want to speak, please can you click the little button, raise hand. And please, good comrades, remember to introduce themselves. Thank you. I'm unmuting you now, David.
Okay, thank you. David Breve, Northampton South Constituency Labour Party, also a Cooperative Party member and a member of Unite. The question I want to ask is really, what was the impact of women feminism and the suffragette movement on the Labour Party at this time?
Okay, Marie is trying to speak. speak, you need to start your video, your camera, please, Marie. There you are.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Hello, Marie.
Hello everybody. This is a superb discussion. Thank you ever so much to everybody concerned. Then I'm trying to remove something in front of my screen. It says the host asked you to start your video. Can I remove?
Don't worry, all good, all good. Just.
Can you remove it?
I can't remove it. You can remove it, but we can see you all right. You can just.
That's it. Hello. Yeah. What concerns me now is that, if I understood well, Labour has always been suffered by capitalism. It came to government on sufferance, if that's the right word. And the condition was that if you accept the Queen or the King, or you dress properly and you are respectable and you respect the empire, then you can put forward quite a lot of left-wing ideas, out of which no doubt the left, the liberals in the Conservatives will take some ideas from in order to confuse everybody. But it seems to me that now things have come to the fact that empire is become quite revolting. No longer it is bringing a booty, which it did in large amount for generations, really. Suddenly it costs, and all the war costs are absolutely staggering. And so empire has lost its ability to draw admiration or acceptance. And at the same time also, there is a direct intervention from empire in the Labour Party in a way which seems to me quite new. And I would be interested to see what Kevin says about the effect this has on the left and on the differentiations in the left, and perhaps a certain quest towards the socialist communist ideas, something that people try to, without having they don't have the books, they don't have the culture in the Labour Party, but there is the intention and the thirst for justice, which is going, it seems to me, which is going to end up looking for the communist ideas. Finished.
Thanks, Marie. Okay, Marianne.
Yeah, I think at some point we should maybe have a look at the role of municipal socialism, and also the role of women in the early Labour Party. There were quite a few prominent women that played quite an important role, and the whole struggle for women and equality within the party as well is something we need to look at, because I think it's quite interesting what we've been discussing tonight, and the question about whether Labour in government is actually in power. And I think we do need to give a lot of thought to that. And you're right, if Corbyn had got into government, we would have been fighting for him to take real power, you know, and actually begin to implement a lot of things that obviously the ruling class wouldn't want implemented. So there would be a battle at some point. But I think maybe we do need to have a look at the role of the sort of campaigns that took place, like the campaigns for that took place in London around getting toilets, so that there were toilets for women. You know, women played a big role in fighting to get amenities and things like that. So I think maybe we need to look at that at some point as well, because I think it poses some of the questions that we're facing today as well.
Yep, interesting point. Okay, Stan, if you want to speak, made you a panelist, but you have to switch your camera on. I've unmuted you. There you are. I'm spotlighting you now. Hello.
Some interesting questions come up. I find it strange I have to look down to see the screen and look up to see the camera. Oh my God. Yes, I mean, the Labour Party, I mean, Kevin spelled out how the Labour Party is wasn't socialist, it was to represent the working class. That was the slogan, wasn't it? The purpose declared at the beginning, working class representation. And that's without the politics of socialism, without working class politics. So naturally, it's got the same, that means that the leadership has the same politics essentially as the ruling class. It's just a question of how to run capitalism better, which is not a very good idea. But when the foundation of the Labour Party is like, it's got a similarity to when the vote was won by increasing sections of the working class. It's a problem for the ruling class, isn't it? They have to incorporate. They can't get rid of Labour. They have to take steps to incorporate and manage it and control it and tame it. And so that's what it's all about. I mean, that's why it's so important. The fact of a mass Labour Party based on the big trade unions that we have is a danger for capitalism, because it might start to get its head together, and it might start, enable the working class to get its head sorted, and it's got massive strength. So it must be tamed and inhibited and so on. That's the problem for the people that run capitalism. So government without power, well, I mean, the whole business of electoralism, of saying that the purpose of the Labour Party is to get elected so it can deliver. That's the slogan of the right wing. And unfortunately, it's largely the belief of the left wing as well, isn't it, in Labour, that you have to be in office in order to deliver. But of course, the government, when you get a Labour government in office, it has, because it's trying to run capitalism, it has to attack the working class, and it always does, and it demoralises. I mean, it takes a very short time from winning a Labour government to office to losing in a disastrous way. And you talk about the 1924 Labour government, it's very short. That's a minority government. It can't possibly do what's necessary for the working class, because it's not just a minority in Parliament, but it's got minority support in the country as well. It was a principle of the Second International that Labour joined in 1908. It was a principle there that you don't take office unless you've got active, conscious support of the majority, not just votes, but votes are, as Engels put it, the votes are a barometer to measure our strength, measure the strength of the working class, if you're talking about votes in relation to a socialist programme. If you're talking about minority support, or even just majority votes but minority active support, then it can't be sustained, can it? And how long did it take now? Till 1924 government, then you had the 1929 to 31 government, very short. Even Attlee's famous government, 1945 to 51. So there's the magic moment where everyone looks back with enthusiastic nostalgia in 1945, and yet 6 years later it's voted out. And I mean, in my lifetime, I remember the two governments in the 60s, and then after Heath got knocked out in 74, you had such a short time from getting Wilson and then Callaghan, and then 1979 is Thatcher. It only took 5 years to knock it out. So we don't want to do that over and over. That's like, what do you call it, Groundhog Day, isn't it? Go around again and again with the same silly method. The way that the Bolsheviks used the elections is a good example, because there's a big distinction between Marxist use of elections and parliament, as Lenin led between 1905 and 1917. That's a way of using what elections you have to make propaganda when people are interested, of having parliamentary representatives that can speak in a way that the rest of us can't, and get attention when the rest of us can't, and get the message across. It's a magnificent, propaganda tool that we can use, but it'd be a mistake to think that then you can legislate socialism. But we do have to win conscious, active support of the majority. And then we can have a government which has got a socialist program which can actually deliver, because the working class can deliver. Okay, that's enough. Thanks.
Thank you, Stan. We have no more people with a hand up, so I'd suggest Kevin can now sum up for 10, 15 minutes if you fancy. And
Okay.
if the internet holds.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I hope I hold out. I'd like to go back to a question that Peter Kennedy asked in the last round, and unfortunately, I admitted it in my reply because I think it's actually quite interesting. He talked about the Liberal Party's yellow books, and he talked in particular that in the late 20s, the Liberals went through a lot of policy development and in particular put forward ideas of managing the economy, and indeed he suggested that those were possibly more coherent than those of the Labour Party. But I think that that the Liberal work wasn't wasted, because many of those ideas would reappear in the form of the Beveridge Report, and indeed many aspects of the 1945 Labour government. And I suppose what's sort of lurking behind my reply there is that many of the pro-capitalist policies of the Labour leadership actually do share many things in common with existing bourgeois politics. And my point about the distinction between the left and the right and the Labour Party, I think, reflects that. I'll probably I will take that up next week when I look at the 45 government. But I think it is quite important that all sorts of bourgeois and pro-capitalist ideas circulated in the Labour Party, and ideas that in retrospect we now think of as being on the left, often did originate from those people who wanted to manage capitalism. So I think that you did allude to a very important point, but the work wasn't wasted. It just reappeared in the Labour Party in a different form. Alan, you talked there about how we might define, the left and the importance of unity and how fragmented we are and so on. Well, calls for unity are always made, and although it's very clear that on many issues, on many basic issues, we can, for example, work together as comrades, in defending party democracy or fighting against the witch hunt, and so on. But there are very clear programmatic differences, and I think Stan outlined those very well in terms of a conception of socialism, about the role of parliament, and indeed about the idea of socialism being the self-activity of the working class. And I think clarity on those particular points, and particularly clarity on how we will resist the attacks by the Labour right, who are essentially the capitalist agents, as it were, working inside the Labour Party, means that that type of agreement, if we agree with the pro-capitalist right, then effectively we're surrendering. So unity around, for example, resistance to the witch hunt and so on, but I think on issues of programme and in particular basic conceptions of socialism, then I think it isn't possible in that way. And one of the things that we've learned here, I would hope that from looking at the Labour government of 24 and 29 to 31, is that many people united around ideas of socialism in our time, and indeed united around a socialist manifesto as they saw it. But in practice, when it came down to it, what was going to be achieved was very different, and the pro-capitalist elements, were very clear that they were going to sabotage that. One other point I would make as well in terms of the pro-capitalist elements in the party is that Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't have only faced the problem with the state. In fact, he would have been in a minority in the not only in the cabinet, but clearly in the parliamentary Labour Party. And in his case, the enemy would very clearly have been at home. So it wouldn't have been that he would have been, a member of a left cabinet. He would have faced not only people stabbing in the front, but as a few other people said, stabbing him clearly in the back and the front and the sides and all over. So that means that the battle is very much within the Labour Party, is very much to fight against the pro-capitalist right in that party. And I think that the failure of Jeremy Corbyn to do that you know, is in line with some of the historical traditions that I've outlined this evening. A couple of comrades asked about women and municipal socialism. And I think those are important areas. You know, the growth of the women's vote in 1918 and also in 1928 and then in 1929, I think was actually a factor in Labour's vote. Many people pointed to the fact that many women voted Labour, and that that it you know, it was a fillip. So I think, and also the role of women activists, you know, campaigning around a whole range of social issues, and particularly in the creation of alternative structures and alternative you know, in patterns from below, as it were, around women's rights, were a very important area. I think municipal socialism is an interesting topic, partly because of its identification with the Fabian gas and water socialism, but also how socialists might use local government. George Lansbury was involved in a struggle in East London, the so-called Polarization, and that has often been taken as a model for other socialists and campaigners at a local level. So it would seem to me that discussing the lessons of that and looking at it in relation to our wider national strategy of the use of Parliament and of councils as platforms for socialism, I think would be useful in that way. Mary, you talked about the impact of imperialism, and I did deal with that to a certain extent in one of the first session. I think that the Labour right was very clearly and very explicitly pro-imperialist, and you know, the first Labour government is an illustration of that. The commitment to the empire, and indeed to the idea of the empire as a civilizing mission, much less the integration of the empire into the economic and the political life of the British state. So from that point of view, I think it is a significant factor. I don't know whether you were alluding to any particular incidents in this period, but it you know, it is clearly a factor. I think there is one point though about the idea of Labour being on sufferance, and one of the reasons why I quoted various politicians in 1924 saying that this was a safe experiment, and indeed the Labour leadership very clearly saw this as an experiment to demonstrate to the capitalist class and to the state that they could work the system and that they could take part in that system, is that I don't really think that you know, by the later stages that they just simply saw they accepted Labour on sufferance. Increasingly, and this is where Peter's point about incorporation and so on comes in, Labour leaders were in a sense incorporated into the state. And one of the points about MacDonald is that in the summer of 1931, he's very clearly willing to work in the interests of that state. So it, you know, stands right about the Labour Party being a site for struggle, and that rather like the vote, it can be used as a weapon. But in its leadership, I think it's very clearly demonstrated that it's quite house trained, and although it may have some unruly followers, fans as it were, you know, the second team of capitalism is more than willing to cooperate in that way. And that's what I think the problem with Jeremy Corbyn was. He was clearly on the left, and as such was susceptible to pressure, and you know, could then have gone in all sorts of different you know, different directions under that sort of pressure. Whether he would have done or not, or whether he would have been prevented from that, I think is you know, is open to question. But you know, we can debate that a little nearer the time. I'd just like to sort of finish up by by thanking you for your comments and so on. I think some quite interesting questions. I was trying to move away from the idea that that MacDonald was simply a traitor, and I was trying to move away from the idea that we had a coherent left in the Labour Party at that stage, a coherent opposition, and that in particular what later emerges and becomes quite useful for many people on the Labour right is to argue a distinction between themselves and MacDonald, which isn't really there. But perhaps the sharpness of my arguments was really devoted at the Labour left, and particularly the ILP. And that is, again, its membership contained many, committed socialists, but in terms of a clear program and in terms of a clear strategy, that was sadly lacking. And so the distinction between them and MacDonald in terms of sincerity is very clear, but in terms of their direction, their strategy and their theory, I think that they in a sense were both trying to manage capitalism in particular ways. MacDonald was explicitly pro-capitalist and was quite willing to attack the working class in the national government. But I think that as David has just put up on there, have we ever had a coherent left? Well, there have been coherent lefts, but the ILP and the left in the 1930s were not amongst them. I would also suggest to comrades, and this is one of the reasons why I put quite a few documents up, is to look at what people were actually saying at the time. Contemporary newspapers, party programs, are very interesting, and often they often are quite revelatory about the politics of the period. And I would really recommend looking at the programs of the ILP and the Labour Party, looking at those documents, both to see their strengths and their weaknesses, and to see the appeal of them. These are documents which are far to the left of much that is produced today. So you can see you can see, I think, the ways that political leaders like MacDonald were able to operate, but you can also see the limitations of their politics and indeed the politics of even of their critics. But that's all to come. Next week, I think, will be one of the important sessions on the 45 government, and I hope I can overcome the communication problems by that stage.
So thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you all next Thursday or before then. We're trying to put a session together for Tuesday, but it's a little shaky at the moment. We're trying our best. Okay, see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.